All right, so to kind of get into the theory behind this work, these are kind of the two questions that really, and it's fun because I don't have to change my slides, right? So the CPD, and it works for both, right? Your CPD and my CPD. And for the deliberative democracy movement. So how do we best address public problems in a diverse democracy, and what kind of communication or engagement processes help us address those, right? And these questions have changed a little bit, and one thing I'll talk about is, this used to say solve, right? And as I do this work, I'll talk a little bit about wicked problems. Is wicked problems a term people have heard of?
Yes, oh, I have.
All right.
I'm really excited.
I was like, excited. I ran into the wicked problems literature a few years ago, and it really kind of fit the way I'm thinking, right? And it forced me to change address to solve, because the kind of problems we're really interested in, we're not going to solve, we're not going to end, right? But we can certainly treat better. We can certainly kind of deal with them in much better ways. So then, how do we do that, right? And as a communication professor, I'm particularly interested in, okay, how do we talk to each other? And how does the quality of the conversations we have affect our decisions? And I very much kind of believe that more and more as we're dealing with these kind of problems, the quality of our conversation has a direct relation with the quality of our communities and our quality of life, right? So how do we kind of improve that? So here's wicked problems. These are Ritter Weber's article in 1973, but then it's kind of exploded the last few years as people realize the usefulness of kind of these concepts, right? But these were actually engineers, trained in the university as engineers, and then they started working for municipalities as kind of planners. And they realized pretty quickly once they started working that the kind of problems they were taught to solve in school and the kind of problems they were dealing with in their jobs were very different. Right? They were taught to kind of solve tame problems, and I'm not sure if I like the phrase tame because it makes it sound like they're easy, right? They can be very complex problems, right? But tame problems have a solution. Right? So they're more kind of technical problems, best solved by experts in science. They can be divided up. One of the basic things they talk about is with a tame problem, the more really smart people study a tame problem, the more they naturally kind of converge, right? So if there's one kind of clear answer, the best way to judge different paths to that answer is efficiency, right? How can you kind of implement that answer with the fewest kind of resources and time and money and people and those type of things, right? But what they recognized, and by the way, the page numbers on the bottom are the page numbers from my workbook, the full workbook. I sent that to you. You'd expect you to print it out, it's 110 pages. But you have most of my slides, not every single one of my slides, most of my slides you have in front of you, so it has a page number. So if any of these slides seem particularly interesting, then you can print out that corresponding page in the course book later on if you want to. So you have about 18 pages of the course book that we'll dig into a little bit as we go. I'll try to remember which ones you have in front of you. You also have the full table of contents of my workbook, so you have a sense of it. And a lot of these concepts I've written on other articles and things like that, so feel free to email me. I'm happy to send you anything else, or email me about a slide and say, hey, and I've got about 300 PDFs organized on my computer. I'll send you a whole bunch of stuff if there's any particular term, or if you want this article, I'll send it to you. As they did the work, they realized that they were dealing with what they called wicked problems. And going back and forth, some people don't like to frame wicked or not. It's funny, I've given this talk that I have wicked problems in the title, and about 3 different times when I've given the talk, someone's pulled the exact same graphic from the play Wicked, right? with the witch on it as it. So it has lots of meanings in a sense. What I like about the use of the word or the phrase wicked problem is a lot of the work that I do is to shift our basic thinking from the problem being wicked people to the problem being what's wicked, right? And that automatically kind of transitions kind of from an adversarial kind of us versus them frame to, okay, we might think very differently, we might kind of rank our values very differently, but we're taking on the same problem in a way, right? So you're putting the wickedness on the problem versus the people, right? But the key aspect, and this is probably the biggest thing I talk about, we'll have 5 bullet points here, but we'll spend a lot more time on this first one, is just the basic nature that wicked problems inherently involve competing on values, paradoxes, and trade-offs that can't be resolved by science. And this is going back to my argumentation days, going back to all the days of me analyzing issues. This just keeps on coming up with all the topics that we've done in the last 10 years. And one quick thing, some people talk about, okay, let's categorize this as a tame problem, this is a wicked problem, or there's other ways, there's typologies. In conflict resolution, there's type 1, type 2, type 3 problems, kind of the hyphens typology people use. I'm not as concerned with kind of like, these are tame problems and these are wicked problems. The way I kind of see it is more is I take a wicked problems frame or a lens to issues, right? So when I'm looking at issues kind of from this impartial perspective, right? I'm particularly looking for these things. Right? And when we choose which topics to take, I particularly take topics that fit that lens. There's probably some topics that fit it better and worse in a way. Right? So I'm not going to make the argument these are wicked problems, these are not. It's like what happens when you look at problems as a wicked problem, and how does that help you change the conversation? Right? And the biggest thing you're looking at when you're looking at problems from a wicked problem perspective is that notion of what are the underlying values, paradoxes, and trade-offs that are involved in this. Right? So here's one example. We've been working in northern Colorado with water. Right? Where I live in Fort Collins, Colorado, it's basically a desert. We don't get very much rain at all, right? We're just on the east side of the mountains. So all the water dumps on the west side of the mountains coming from the Pacific, and we don't get much, right? We get a whole bunch of water in May and June because all the snow melts, right? So we have a river that roars in May and June, but you can stand over in December and have the river between your legs, right? The big river. But for the last 100 years, we have built reservoirs and irrigation ditches and actually pumped water over from the western slope and all these kind of things. So we have a whole, we have agriculture. I mean, there's lots of farms all in northern Colorado. In some ways, they shouldn't be there. There's not enough rain to have a farm, right? But because of this irrigation, because of all these reservoirs and things like that, the problem is northern Colorado is a wonderful place to live. And people are moving like crazy there, right? And they need water, right? Northern Colorado is also a wonderful place to make beer, right? Because you've got great water, right? So more and more breweries are going. We're finding out northern Colorado is a place that there's natural gas, right? So it's a good place for fracking, right? But they need a lot of water, right? And then we're also realizing in the last 30 years or so that the river itself we need to keep more water in it for it to be healthy. We're learning more about healthy rivers, right? And it's very much a working river. We're taking so much water in that river to do all these different things. So it's creating conflict, right? Everyone wants water, and there's not enough water. So we started working with the Northern Colorado Community Foundation and the CSU Water Institute with a basic kind of assumption that this is going to become more and more of an issue. We need to learn how to talk about water. And most of the conversation was very polarized and very adversarial. Nasty letters to the editor and things like that, right? So as I started studying it, looking at how do people talk about water, looking at the articles in the paper and the letters to the editor and then the comments under those and those kind of things, these are 9 kind of things, the kind of underlying values, right? These are 9 things people care about. And theoretically, the important point about this is if you take each of these one at a time, they're all good things, right? The problem with the water conflict wasn't that some people have bad values and some people have good values. It's like, these are all good things that people want, right? The problem isn't, the list, the problem is the tensions between them, right? Some of them go well together, right? So when we have water for local farms, we tend to have open space because the farms are kind of open space, right? And we tend to have a good local food economy. So those 3 kind of go together, right? But all the other ones, not so much, right? If we need water for homes and lawns, it's got to come from somewhere, which is coming from the river, which is making the river less healthy, right? But if we start charging a lot more for water, right, well then the cost of living kind of goes up and that has economic impact, so there's all these tensions. So the conversation we need to be having in northern Colorado is how do we deal with these tensions, right? But that's not the conversation we naturally have. The conversation is natural within the boxes. There's interest groups from a lot of these boxes, right? There's experts for a lot of those boxes within the box, right? And the way it's framed, and a lot of the work that we do in deliberation, I teach a studies and persuasion class, do a lot of psychology, right? A lot of what I learned as I kind of did this is the reason our conversations are so bad because most of our conversations are kind of taking advantage of the flaws of human nature, right? Our brains are wired, we want things to be simple. We want things to be good versus evil, right? We want to surround ourselves with people that tell us we're right and kind of ignore people that kind of challenge us. We don't want to deal with cognitive dissonance. We don't want to deal with tension, right? So most of our messages kind of fit into that and kind of feed that in a way, right? So the people that are fighting for the healthy river, they frame things as if the people that disagree with them are for unhealthy rivers, right? And when we started these projects, the first thing we said is, you know what? No one in this room is anti-river. There's no one here that just hates rivers, right? They might think some of the other things are more important than a river, right? But it's not so much that they're willing to accept an unhealthy river, it's just that they don't see that. They have their blinders on, right? And they're wanting to focus on the values that they think are important and ignore the others, right? And that's how the conversation goes when the conversation is kind of fractured. So a lot of the work that we do is, okay, how do we kind of put people in the same space that they understand this, that they understand that people on the other side are coming from a good place, right? And the important thing here is the balance is not saying, well, everyone has a value, so everyone's opinion is fine, right? So then we should just, No, we still have to make judgments. We still have to make decisions, right? So it's the starting point, recognizing people are coming from a good place, but the ending point is recognizing if we as a community struggle, we probably have to make some decisions of which ones are more important to us, right? So it's not, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, there's an interesting tension between open-mindedness and closed-mindedness, right? We want open-mindedness of where people are coming from. At some point, we need to be closed-minded because we have to make tough decisions. And it's kind of two sides of a coin in a way. Right? Yeah. So another little exercise, and grab the little clickers. We'll do this. See, what is this? Some of y'all are at an advantage, but I wouldn't be surprised if our Polish friend will get it first. This is the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Embedded within the preamble are 5 kind of values, right? Justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, and liberty, right? I've gotten in trouble before with historians, but if we just kind of translate those into a little bit more historic, I'm not arguing that this is what the founders meant, right? But if we just translate it, I do a lot of this with K-12 and college students, right? So I'm going to make the argument here that these are 5 basic American values, right, or democratic values: justice, security and safety, equality, freedom for us, and freedom for future generations, right? So I'm going to ask you first: how many here in this room prefer justice to injustice? Raise your hand. You're ruining my example.
Sorry.
Yeah, so the point here is we all, right?
I'm overthinking.
Justice is the truth. Okay, so same thing. How many of y'all prefer kind of security versus kind of always being scared for your life? So if we went through all 5, they're universal, right? These values, a value by definition is a good thing. Right?
Well, what do you mean by freedom for us? Like just us?
Well, it's just because they talk about liberty ourselves and liberty for posterity, right? So
Okay.
freedom is we get to make our own choices, but then freedom for future generations is you think other, right? So you'll see how I set this up as a
Okay,
pitch, right?
okay.
How much do you care about your freedom versus the freedom of your children's children? Right?
Okay.
Should they have the kind of same choices in a way, right? So the issue here isn't that some of us have these values and some don't. We all have the values. We all respect the values, right? What happens when you have to rank the values, though? If you had to pick one as your trump, that this one is more important than the others, right? Which one would it be? Just press the button on your keypad, turn green for a second. I've done this with so many different groups. This is a small group, so hopefully my illustration will work here, right? Do you have a clicker?
I do,
Okay.
and I clicked.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So a couple more. You see the responses on the top. I don't know if y'all use these. We use these a lot in our meetings to kind of be able to jump from small group to kind of large group processes. Right? There we go. Okay. Yeah, it's a little harder with a smaller group, right? So 6 of y'all picked freedom, right? 2 of y'all picked equality. Normally when I do this with a group that's around 15 early, I normally have at least 1 vote for all 5, right? But with a smaller group, you sometimes kind of don't have it, right? So what's the least important to you?
Wow.
This can be a little bit more difficult, right? Which one are you most willing to give up? You finally got a response. This one always takes a little longer, right? The first one's easy. And I do recognize that if I passed out a note card and told you to define these, we would get 8 different definitions, right? So it's just, what does this word mean to you, right?
I can't do it.
Okay, we're still. That's the point, right? It's hard to pull it out, right? Your brain is automatically going to frame things in your choices based on a positive value, right? But you don't want to engage kind of the trade-off. Right? So we have ones refusing to vote.
Just me.
We'll move on. Alright, so same thing. We got 4, which is interesting. So we can totally get into Maslow's here, right? So 3 of y'all throughout the future generations. What's sad is y'all are all educators, right? It's really sad when I do this. Like I do school board members, right? And still, freedom for future generations is where it's like, come on. And the interesting. I need to write a paper on this one because I do get security and safety, the most often one that people are going to throw away, right? I think there's a couple different reasons for that, and see if y'all disagree with me. One is the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Security is actually a more basic need, right? But what Maslow taught us is once a need is met, it's forgotten, right? So most of us probably don't fear for our lives. Security isn't an issue that much for us, right? So it's easy for us to say, oh, I'm willing to give that up, right? Even though it's probably one of those basic needs, right? So that's kind of one psychological thing. It's like once that's met, that's why if I'm selling you a security system, I have to scare you first. right? I have to tell you that people in your neighborhood are getting kind of, robbed now. So once now I establish that basic fear, then I can sell you that product. Right? The second one is security. Big one. That's why I added safety to this. When I just had security, people always kind of made it negative. And the reason is, we generally, people that kind of do this kind of work tend to be more on the progressive side. They want to kind of improve their societies. And security is a word that people that they disagree with use as a hammer and hit them over the head, right? So even though security is a positive value, it's been used as a rhetorical term so much to kind of strike fear, right, that they have a negative kind of response to that. But basically, normally what happens when I have a bigger group, right, every single one of them picks as the most important, and every single one of them gets picked by someone as the least important. Right? And if I ask, it's not that the people that pick security, again, don't want to be secure or don't want to be safe, it's that I force you to make a choice. Right? The question is, are we actually forced to make a choice? Are there any tensions between these? That if we kind of focus on one of these values, we tend, and I'm not saying a bipolar kind of dichotomy that automatically is a zero sum, right? But just a general tension that if we focus on one of these values, we probably tend to kind of give up a little bit on the other value, right? I'm seeing some yeses. What are you seeing?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
For example, after 9/11, right?
Yep.
I think the country as a whole focused more on security and safety, and so that now we have all these different steps that we have to do, especially when you board a plane, right? That's my example.
Right.
And
So
then
what are we giving up to serve security?
freedom for us.
Yeah, we're giving up freedom, right? I just flew here yesterday, right? I wanted to bring my big tube of toothpaste, but they won't let me, right? And they took away my freedom for my toothpaste because of the necessary security, that tension in a way, right? Any other tensions you see in there? Yeah.
Just kind of inversely, that if you get justice, true justice, then security won't be an issue. That's
Yeah, so some of them will kind of combine. Justice is an interesting term. I'll go back to Aristotle in a way. Aristotle's kind of notion of virtues is virtue is the ideal mean between extremes, and justice was one of the examples, right? So justice itself is a balance, right? Justice is getting exactly what you deserve, no more, no less, right? Whether that deserve is merit or deserve is punishment, right? So you can get, justice is you can get too much justice or too little. You're kind of getting it in the middle, right? So justice is an interesting tension with itself. Freedom.
Oh, sorry.
But
I think that there's some tension between justice and equality as well. If you've seen, there's like an infographic, I don't know if you could call it that shows what justice looks like and what equality looks like, right? So equality is everyone has the same size box to stand on to look over a fence.
Looking over the fence. Yeah.
Whereas justice is everyone has the box that they need in order to everyone to be able to see over the fence. So I do think that there is some tension between those.
No, if you go purely kind of equality of saying, everyone gets the same salary in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
That could clearly be unjust.
Mm-hmm.
If some people have made more sacrifices to be able to go to school or those type of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of merit in a sense,
Yeah.
right? It's always interesting. A lot of when I deal with college students, equality is normally the number one,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's some irony there. It's like you're a college student, right? I mean, you're in college because you want inequality, right? You want a better paying job. You want to be better than the average person,
Mm-hmm.
But equality is still such a broad term in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think normally, again, when I do college students, equality and freedom are like the twin towers when we say which one's the most important one, right? We're a little bit different here. Well, no, you got freedom. So yeah, freedom and equality are the two you pick. So there's still. There's a tension between freedom and equality, right? Especially in a capitalistic system, an economic system, right? I mean, history shows the more freedom we have, the more inequality we have,
Mm-hmm.
right? The rich get richer, the poor tend to get poorer, right? So if we want equality, we tend to have to violate freedom to give inequality, to kind of give from the rich to the poor. Right? So it's so fascinating, when I ask these college students, like, what are the kind of primary American values? We hear equality and freedom. When I ask them, how often have you ever tackled the tension between those two? They haven't. They're individual kind of values that are used especially election years, right? They're used as premises of persuasion, of broad values of people are going to kind of apply, right? But the critical conversation is the tension between them, not just the application of them. Right? But our brains just want the application, right? We want to say, I'm for freedom, so I support these things, and not recognize that there's going to be inherent trade-offs. So yeah, so we do this kind of analysis with almost every single project. We've been doing a lot of stuff with local food, right? These are all the things we want food to do. Once again, individually, these are all good things, right? The problem is there's tensions between them. Right? And the loudest voices, the activist groups, the experts are inherently going to narrow and focus on one thing, right? Whereas in reality, as a community, to take on these issues, we need to focus on the tension. Right? The triple bottom, how many people have heard triple bottom line, that term? kind of growing now. Single bottom line is just profit, right? Companies need it, that's the bottom line. So more and more kind of environmental perspectives are talking about sustainability as a triple bottom line. It's profit, people, and planet, or economics, equality, and environment in a sense. The city of Fort Collins, all their city government decisions now are based on the triple bottom line. They have to do an analysis and say, how is this going to improve the economics of the city, but how does this deal with social, what kind of social impacts does it have, what kind of environmental impacts does it have, right? But this is a balance, right? Those three things don't go so well together in some ways, right? So how do we kind of change? And part of it is changing the conversation, because for years the environmental movement has been kind of somewhat anti-economics, right? There's been a clear tension between economics and the environment. And this was a change in the conversation, saying, you know what, we have to recognize that profit matters, right? These companies have to make money, right? So they changed the conversation from saying the environment has to be more important than the economy to saying we need to find the right balance between these, right? Which is an important way to change the conversation, right? Because you're getting away from good versus evil, you're getting away from adversarial stuff, right? And now you're working together to kind of find that balance, right? I do a lot of stuff, again, primarily with K-12, but I think, especially here at UHD, would be the same thing. As I look at people of arguing to improve education, there's tons of tensions in there. Like one of the big ones I deal with a lot, is you just see the blinders on. There's so much focus on innovation now and constant improvement with K-12, right? But there's no recognition that there's a trade-off there. I mean, innovation is such a wonderful word, right? Who would be against innovation? But if it's constant innovation and constant change, teachers aren't doing the same thing 2 years in a row. There's no stability, right? They never catch up to the learning curve, right? They never get to learn how to do something and kind of, so there's this constant, but that word innovation is just, slammed on them so much that they don't realize the trade-off, right? So how do we kind of start talking about, yeah, we want innovation, yeah, we want to get better, right? But we can't try to have constant change in a way, right? Or the same thing, there's probably at UHD, I imagine, and a lot of community colleges that I work with a lot as well, kind of nationally, there's so much focus on completion, right? That we focused on access for years. Right now, we're doing pretty good with access in some ways, but we're not doing so well with the completion, right? But then if we focus on completion, like the goal is kind of people graduating, right? Clearly, there's a tension there with quality and those type of, it'd be easy to graduate people if we didn't care if they actually learned anything, right? So you start kind of, again, your mind frame is what are the tensions underlying that? How do we put those tensions on the table, and how do we kind of work on them? And the biggest point, I guess, is that doesn't happen naturally, right? Again, the loudest voices are always going to want to frame things in very strategic ways that only certain values are important, right? So that the role of what I do as a delivered practitioner is to kind of see, actually to complicate things, like these are the tensions, and then to try to give people, equip people to be able to actually deal with those tensions. So this is kind of the theory behind this. This is from an argumentation professor, Kijn Kroman, from Belgium, actually. But he basically makes this argument that we all actually have the same values. What makes us different is how we rank them, right? And those rankings are important because those rankings have direct kind of connection with decisions that we're making, right? So the value hierarchy is what I made you just do, right? Okay, here's 5 values, they're all important. If we take them one at a time, we all agree they're good things, right? But then when we ask you to rank them, we got some differences, right? And those differences are important. A value dilemma is a little bit different. It's like when 2 specific values are in tension with each other, which one wins, right? And value hierarchy is abstract. It's very easy for us to say, yeah, that's what's important to us, but then how we live out everyday life, that might be different, right? Food that tastes good is often an intention that food is what's good for you, right? If I asked you to rank kind of, what's more important, your health or pleasure, most of us would say our health, but then what you decide to eat every day, which one wins, which one wins for me. So, that's that conversation. How do we rank these things? For some reason I had 2 sets of those. Yeah, so here are some of the tensions that we just talked about, just in terms of the tension between those 5 key American values, right? I guess what I didn't mention, you asked about freedom for future generation. There's a tension between freedom for us and freedom for future generation, right? The environmental movement's like, hey, if we don't kind of curtail some of our choices now, our children's children might not have choices to, enjoy things like trees. Okay? So we kind of start negotiating that tension in a way. And I mentioned justice versus justice as the tension in itself between getting more than you deserve versus getting less than you deserve. And here are some other kind of just basic tensions we deal with a lot, right? Flexibility, innovation versus consistency, tradition, I kind of mentioned a little bit. Cooperation versus competition. I do a lot of collaborative work in the community. And again, collaboration is such a kind of powerful term now, right? And competition in so many ways is seen as this bad thing, right? But there's some good things from competition, right? So that tension, we need to talk about that a little bit more. How do we kind of get the best out of competition, but also collaboration and avoid the worst? And well, specifically, since there's so much interest in applications and classrooms, for sure tomorrow, I'll go through polarity management. Is that a term people heard in here, polarity management? It's a management term, really kind of useful stuff I run into like the last year of really kind of helping people think through some of these key tensions. And we've actually used it in public engagement about 5 or 6 times, and it's worked really well. So that's the main kind of the heart of a lot of this theory that we'll be talking about, and why I spent so much time on it, is this notion that a wicked problem is inherently dealing with competing underlying values. And that's what the conversation needs to be structured around. And too often that's not what the conversation is structured around, right? So a lot of the work that we do is getting to do that. A few other things about wicked problems. So any proposed solution to a wicked problem tends to create new problems. This is why you don't solve a wicked problem, you treat it better. Right? If the problem is a tension between values or natural inclinations to focus on one value, equality, right? So then we develop policies to deal with inequality, which maybe they work, right? We get more equality, but then we're probably going to lose some other stuff, right? So by nature, when we problem solve, we want to narrow in and focus, but then that focus kind of, you're creating other problems elsewhere, right? So a lot of what deliberation is it's systems thinking, right? It's backing up and seeing the connections between things, which certainly complexifies things, right? But what you're dealing with deliberate, that tension between being too complex and being too simple is a constant negotiation within deliberate. How do we kind of simplify these things so the public can kind of engage them? But in a lot of ways, we're complexifying them because right now the public's only seeing one value, or some public's seeing one value, some public's seeing another value, some public's seeing, and we're trying to kind of get them to think about the connection between those values. So systemic thinking is another kind of important literature to come into this. Optimal solutions to wicked problems often require adaptive changes rather than technical ones. Adaptive changes means behavior has to change. And this is important, again, an argument why we need to engage broader audiences. We're not going to find good kind of treatments for wicked problems by experts in the back room. Right? Experts in the back room can certainly help us kind of understand things, but the public has to be involved. A lot of the work that I do with K-12, for K-12 education to work well, students are going to have to change how they act, parents are going to have to change how they act, teachers are going to have to change, administrators are going to have to change. And if we know anything, particularly in the United States, people don't change because an expert tells them to. They need to be involved in the conversation in a way. And that's a lot of the work. We'll get into this a little bit more with the notion of democratic governance. But dealing with wicked problems requires kind of the whole community. Yes, there might be policy changes that are needed, but there's individual changes that are needed. And there's a role for nonprofits, there's a role for private industry, there's a role for institutions like education and religious institutions. So a lot of our conversations, once people recognize it's a wicked problem, then it opens up to think about who are all the stakeholders and how they involved. And this is one of the key things of switching it from the adversarial kind of, at least in the United States, right, left, Democrat, Republican, progressive, kind of conservative. Right? Because when you get away from the focus being the role of government and the focus being how do we as a community respond to this, with government being one of our tools, right? All of a sudden, a lot of those divisions melt away, right? A lot of people have the same beliefs in a lot of ways. The linchpin of disagreement is whether it's the government's job or not, right? And once you kind of get away from that conversation, it sparks a lot of different ways of talking, right? So adaptive changes, as we're talking about, people need to own and really kind of take ownership of those solutions for them to really work. So we can't rely on experts as much. Addressing wicked problems necessitates effective collaboration and communication across multiple perspectives. We need all those stakeholders to be part of it. We need to understand each other. We need to see people from the different boxes and hear from them. And again, this is what doesn't happen right now, right? The internet's wonderful for connecting with people that you agree with, right? No matter how freaky you believe, you can find people on the internet that believe just like you. The internet's very bad at interaction, right? And we naturally, again, gather around people that think like us, right? So we need more. So a lot of the work that we do is getting people that think differently in the same room. We don't know how to talk to those people, so then we tend to need help, right? And that's the role of facilitator in the process that we'll talk about. And then last, wicked problems require creativity, innovation, and imagination, right? And this is the really exciting thing about the work that we've seen kind of in the years, because if we still see the issue as a simplistic kind of good versus evil, right, the solution's obvious. Get rid of the evil people, right? Once we recognize that the solution is tough, right, that the problem is tough, and even the people we disagree with are coming from a good place, right? The first reaction is, oh man, this is tough. But then the second reaction is you spark creativity, right? Now you start really thinking, right? And that's a really exciting part of the work, that once people kind of reframe the problem and they see it, now is when you're going to start thinking about, okay, how do we negotiate these tensions? How do we transcend these tensions, right? How do we kind of really think about how we're dealing with this stuff, which is a much more interesting conversation. I think there's a lot of creativity, innovation, and imagination in our politics. Most of it's spent on making the other side look bad, right? So how do we repurpose that, all that creativity, to how do we actually deal with these problems together?